Welcome to this webinar on the new AmeriCorps State and National Progress Report instructions for program year 2019 and beyond. I'm Sarah Yu. I'm the Program Impact Manager for AmeriCorps State and National. I'll be leading you through the content for today's webinar, and as always, I'm more than happy to answer your questions as we go through. There's that Q&A box. Please feel free to use it anytime during the webinar to type your questions in. I'll pause as needed to answer questions as we go through, and we'll definitely have time at the end for a Q&A session as well. Here's what we're going to cover today on the webinar. Purpose of grantee progress reports is where we will start out. We'll talk about reporting requirements and the structure of the report. Then we'll focus in on the changes that were made in 2019. We'll do a more deep dive overview of GPR content for the 2019 program year and beyond, looking specifically at the different kinds of grants that we support here at AmeriCorps State and National. And then, as I mentioned, we will end with Q&A and also answer questions earlier if needed. The instructions for grantee progress reports, GPR of course is our shorthand, so I will use that acronym throughout, but the grantee progress report is the fuller name. The instructions for them usually start off with a statement about the purpose of those GPRs. So for folks on this webinar, if you've been in the AmeriCorps world a long time, you might have memorized this text by now, but if you are newer to AmeriCorps or if it's been a few years since you stopped to read that particular part of the instructions, here's a quick summary. As the name Grantee Progress Report suggests, we primarily use progress reports to monitor progress. In other words, to see if grantees are meeting the goals and objectives described in their grant applications. The data that you report for your performance measures is part of that assessment, and so are your narrative descriptions of your progress over the course of the year. The progress report is a venue for you to share your successes with us, and CNCS uses information from your progress reports to amplify and share your successes. The progress report is also a place where you can talk frankly about the challenges you've encountered and the areas where you need help and support. We will use that progress report information to help us here at CNCS identify policies that might need to be changed or updated, or new training materials we need to develop, or areas that could benefit from peer learning and communities of practice. Finally, the progress reports are CNCS's most important data collection instrument. In the same way that grantees are accountable to their funders to accomplish the goals they set out to achieve, CNCS as an agency is also accountable to our stakeholders, which are Congress and the American public, to demonstrate that AmeriCorps service is making a difference in meeting community needs. So we use the data you report to us to answer our stakeholders' questions about the impact of AmeriCorps programs across the country. And that's why we put such a strong emphasis on data quality. You've probably heard some from me about that in the past. You'll also hear more about that later in today's presentation. Progress reports are a government-wide requirement for federal grants, spelled out in the Uniform Guidance, also referred to as 2 CFR 200. These regulations say that semi-annual progress reports, meaning reports that are submitted twice per year, need to be due 30 days after the end of the reporting period, and annual progress reports, meaning submitted once per year, must be due 90 days after the end of the reporting period. CNCS uses those regulations as the foundation and creates terms and conditions for each grant type, which lists the specific reporting periods and due dates for progress and financial reports for that type of grant. For AmeriCorps State and National Program grants, which I'm using that term to refer to grants that enroll and place AmeriCorps members, there's a single annual GPR, we generally call that the end of year GPR, due at the end of December. If you are a longtime grantee or commission, you may remember that this report used to be due at the end of October, but because we switched a year ago from semi-annual to annual GPRs, we had to change the due date to meet the Uniform Guidance, the 2 CFR requirements. In addition to this annual or end of year GPR, There is a final GPR due 90 days after the end of the multi-year grant period, including any no-cost extensions you may have received on that grant. The final GPR, if you've completed it before, you'll know that it has a very different format and instructions than the end-of-year GPR, and it also has a different and rather strange name in Egrants. You'll see it referred to as the Progress Report Light Quarterly, even though it is neither light nor quarterly. Egrants is a lot of fun. AmeriCorps state and national planning grants, which are designed to prepare an organization to apply for an AmeriCorps program grant, have different reporting requirements. Because these grants are only a year in length, they have a single GPR due 90 days after the end of that one-year grant period. And it's important to note that this applies only to direct planning grants, by which I mean planning grants who apply directly to CNCS and are managed directly by CNCS. Commission planning subgrantees need to follow the reporting requirements set by the Commission, and Commissions report on those planning subgrants along with their program subgrants in their AmeriCorps program grant GPR. Speaking of commissions, commission grants, which include Commission Support Grant, Commission Investment Fund, and Volunteer Generation Fund grants, all follow reporting patterns that are similar to each other. They have a single end-of-year GPR. This is due at the end of March for Commission Support and Commission Investment Fund grants, and at the end of December for Volunteer Generation Fund grants. Their final GPRs are all due 90 days after the end of the grant, plus those no-cost extensions if applicable. The final GPRs are in lieu of the last end-of-year GPR. That means they take the place of the last end-of-year GPR. So in practice, a final GPR for these grants looks no different than an end-of-year GPR. Same format, same instructions, and so forth. The only difference is the due date. For the final, it would be 90 days after the end of the grant period rather than a fixed due date. All GPRs for AmeriCorps state and national and commission grants are submitted via the eGrants Progress Report module. That is the lovely orange screens that you see a little snip of on this slide. I'm guessing that all of you on the webinar are familiar with these in some capacity. However, depending on the GPR, the Progress Report module does function a little differently. For AmeriCorps program and planning grants, progress reports don't become visible to grantees until 2 months before the due date. For other grant types, commission grants, progress reports become visible as soon as the reporting period begins. Also, in differences, comment and explanation fields are formatted differently in the different GPR types, and so is the mechanism for clarification. Clarification for AmeriCorps program grants and planning grants is handled right in the eGrants interface itself. For KIF, CSG, VGF grants, it's handled via email. Now, every progress report includes at least one tab, one or more tabs, that request different types of information. On the screenshot in the slide, you can see some example tabs. You can see the tab structure there. Some tabs focus on the performance data and associated explanations. Others focus on narrative responses. The instructions for each GPR type will tell you which tabs you need to complete for each GPR and what information needs to be provided on each tab. So I did notice, thank you if you use the question and answer box. Keep the questions coming. I did notice that there was one question that already came in saying, what changes were made from last year? So thank you for asking that question. This is where we will talk about that, the GPR changes that were made in 2019. Again, if you've been around for a while, you may know that AmeriCorps State and National has revised our GPR instructions several times over the years to try to make the GPR a more effective instrument to achieve those progress reporting purposes I talked about earlier. The most recent revision began in the winter of 2019. We took the instructions through a full OMB clearance process to make sure that the changes we were making were as transparent as possible. What that meant is that there were multiple opportunities for all of you to review the proposed changes and to submit comments on them. So if you are one of the organizations who provided public comments between March and July of 2019, thank you for that. Your feedback was much appreciated, and it helped to shape the final data collection questions which received final clearance from OMB last month, hence the webinar today. We are currently working on putting those approved questions into the full GPR instructions format, which includes screenshots and step-by-step guidance. That process will be done by the end of December. So the updated GPR instructions documents will be posted on our grantee progress report website. That's the link that you see on the slide here in December. But we wanted to roll out the final approved questions to you as soon as possible so that you can plan accordingly and make sure that you have the necessary data collection systems in place for your 2019 grant year. Of course, I know that many of you on the webinar today are currently in the middle of GPR preparation and submission for end of year GPRs for the 2018 grant year. Those are due at the end of December. So I want to reassure you that what I'm talking about today on this webinar, these updated instructions, do not affect the 2018 GPRs that you are about to submit. The instructions for those GPRs, the 2018s, are already on the Grantee Progress Report website, and they will not change. So everything we're talking about for the rest of this presentation, everything we will talk about will be for the 2019 grant year and beyond. This slide covers the most significant content changes overall in the 2019 data collection questions. First of all, we updated the demographic indicators portion of the GPR and renamed it performance data elements. There are new required and optional elements for most GPR types, and I'll describe those elements specifically on later slides. For ASN program grants, there are also new optional member-focused performance data elements that take the place of the member-focused national performance measures that were available prior to 2019. And we also simplified the method for reporting on these performance data elements. Grantees can report the data by time period rather than trying to track the numbers by program year or by member cohort. The time period will be the one that matches the federal fiscal year, October 1st through September 30th. And I'll show you on the next couple of slides how this will actually work and how it simplifies things for grantees. I do want to make one important note. You see it in italics at the bottom of this slide. The time period-based reporting applies to performance data elements, but not to performance measures. Performance measure targets are set in the application based on program year, so performance measure actuals also need to be reported based on program year, not time period. The second significant change was to streamline and update the GPR narrative prompts. The goal was to focus the prompts on actual activities that took place during the reporting period, not on intended or future activities. This better differentiates GPRs from grant applications and will hopefully reduce some of the cutting and pasting we occasionally see where grantees copy existing application content into their GPR text boxes. That's not what we want, so hopefully the updated prompts will resolve that. Let's look on this slide at an example of how data will be reported for AmeriCorps state and national grantees under those updated 2019 performance data elements. Let's start by grounding ourselves in the terms and conditions for the 2019 grant year. If you have a 2019 new recompete or continuation AmeriCorps grant, hopefully you have read your terms and conditions, and if you have, you would have seen that the reporting period for your progress report is the start of the award year through September 30th of 2020. The GPR will be due December 31st, 2020. That's 90 days after the end of the reporting period. So scenario one, which you see on this slide, is a relatively uncomplicated grant where in program year 2019, the members enroll in a single cohort and serve from October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020. That means that the member activities, outputs, and outcomes exactly align with the timeline of the federal fiscal year. So the way the program reports on performance data elements versus performance measures is basically the same. For the performance data elements, the program will report all data collected between 10/1 and 9/30 of the following year. For the performance measures, the program will report all outputs and outcomes for the members who served during this program year. So that's nice and easy. But we know that with the large diversity of AmeriCorps program models around the country, things are often not that easy. And And that's especially true for the commissions on the webinar today. We know that your sub-grantees may start and end at various times during the year and use different enrollment patterns. But all of their data needs to be reported on the same GPR that's due at one particular point in time. So let's talk about some scenarios that are not quite as straightforward as scenario 1 on the last slide. Our second scenario, which you see here, involves a program whose members still serve as a single cohort, but the timing of the cohort is off-shifted from the timing of the federal fiscal year. The 2019 members finish serving by the end of June, and their 2020 cohort begins serving right afterward and has already served several months by the end of the reporting period as expressed in the terms and conditions. Now, for performance measures, it's important in a situation like this, and in all situations, to keep outputs and outcomes distinct by cohort. Again, that's because targets are set by application, by program year, so actuals need to be able to be compared back to targets. So under this scenario, scenario 2, the program will report all of the outputs and outcomes achieved by their 2019 member cohort under their performance measures, but will hold off on reporting performance measure outputs and outcomes for the 2020 member cohort until the next year, the following year GPR. For performance data elements, the approach is simpler, and it should make it easier to report on these values. The program should report all data collected between October 1st, 2019 and September 30th, 2020, regardless of which member cohort or cohorts contributed to those figures. Spoiler alert, this approach will not change regardless of the scenario. We have 2 more scenarios to look at. It will be the same. You'll see that as we move on to scenarios 3 and 4. Here's scenario 3, where the cohort of 2019 members starts serving in January 2020 and does not conclude their service until the following December. This means that they are still actively serving as of September 30th, which again is the end of the reporting period as expressed in the terms and conditions. Meanwhile, last year's member cohort, the 2018 cohort, served all the way up through December of 2019. Again, for performance measures, it's important to track outputs and outcomes by program year so you can compare progress against the targets you set for that year. So under this scenario, the grantee should report all outputs and outcomes achieved by the 2019 member cohort by the time the GPR is submitted, knowing that it may not be complete, but all the ones that they have by the time the GPR is submitted. But given that the 2018 cohort was still serving through December, it's likely that there were outputs and outcomes from the 2018 member cohort that weren't able to be reported on the previous end-of-year GPR. The grantee should report those now as well, and they should specify in the explanation which outputs and outcomes are connected to each member cohort. If you've completed AmeriCorps GPRs in the past, you'll recognize that approach. We have asked you to do that for the last couple of years. But it's pretty complicated, we know that. Happily, reporting on the new performance data elements is not nearly as complicated under this scenario. Just like in the previous scenario, the grantee should report all data collected between 10/1 and 9/30, regardless of which member cohort is connected to. So far, we've only looked at scenarios where members serve in a single cohort. And it's true that the majority of AmeriCorps programs operate that way, but some do not. And many programs will occasionally have some members that end up serving off-cycle due to suspensions or refill slots or a combination of factors. So scenario 4 reflects that more complicated reality. In this scenario, 2019 members enroll at different times during the program year and serve in multiple cohorts that overlap with the 2020 program year. Similarly, some 2018 members are still serving when the 2019 program year begins. So at any given point in the year, the grantee is likely to have members from more than one program year who are serving simultaneously. That may sound familiar to some of you on the line, and that is fine. For performance measures, the grantee needs to have a system in place to identify and track outputs and outcomes by program year. Again, this is not new. It's been this way for some time. On the 2019 end-of-year GPR, the program should report the outputs and outcomes they have collected to date from the 2019 member cohort, plus any remaining 2018 outputs and outcomes that didn't get reported on the last end-of-year GPR. but they should hold off on reporting outputs and outcomes for the 2020 member cohort until the next GPR, which will be the 2020 GPR. So essentially, this is a combination of scenarios 2 and 3 for performance measures. For performance data elements, this is a scenario where you can really start to see the benefit of having a time period-based reporting system. Instead of trying to track performance data elements by distinct member cohort and program year, the grantee can use the same approach that was used in all of those previous scenarios. Report all the data collected between October 1st and September 30th, regardless of which member cohort it pertains to. As you have seen, this approach for reporting on performance data elements did not change regardless of scenario, and we really do hope that that will make it easier for all of you to report those data points to CNCS. So let's spend some time looking at what the new performance data elements and narrative prompts actually are for each GPR type. Beginning on this slide and continuing for the next dozen slides or so, items that are marked in bold are new or are substantially revised from last year. The slides will also clearly indicate which performance data elements and narratives are required for all grantees and which are optional. This slide shows the performance data elements that are required for all AmeriCorps state and national program grants. Two of them are essentially the same as they have been for many years: the number of individuals who applied to be AmeriCorps members and the number of volunteers recruited or managed. Notice that we have removed the distinction between episodic and ongoing volunteers. All volunteers can be reported in the same field for 2019 and beyond. The new required performance data element is the dollar amount of resources leveraged by the program. I say that it's new, but in some ways it actually isn't new. This is very similar to the other revenue field in the AmeriCorps application that has asked for the same information for several years. But that field in the application was always a projected figure rather than an actual figure. The field on the GPR asks for the actual dollar amount of resources outside of formal match that was leveraged to support the program between October 1st and September 30th. The next set of performance data elements is only required for grantees for whom the indicator is relevant to their program model. Word relevant underlined there. And I'll talk on the next slide about how the word relevant is defined. Some of the performance data elements on this slide have been on the AmeriCorps GPR for many years, such as the number of veterans served and the number of individuals served in disaster situations. Others are new, such as the number of children and youth served, the number of acres of public land supported, and the number of individuals receiving job training or placement. This set of performance data elements are all focused on program beneficiaries, not AmeriCorps members. The AmeriCorps member focused ones that I mentioned earlier are on a later slide. CNCS will be providing you with official definitions for all of these indicators. Those definitions will also be posted along with the instructions by the end of December. I do want to let you know, though, that like in the revised performance measures from 2019, the definitions will be broad categories, large buckets that can encompass and include a variety of service models and situations. So the definition of relevant. CNCS is defining relevant as something that is a significant part of a grantee's program design and theory of change. This is self-determined by the grantee. In other words, it is up to you whether or not a particular indicator is relevant to you. However, we do want to use some common sense here. If it seems to CNCS that something is a core part of your program model and you aren't reporting on it, we might follow up with a clarification to ask why you haven't provided the data. If, in contrast, the activity is peripheral to your program design, or if a particular metric is not connected to your logic model, then the performance data element probably isn't relevant to your program. However, that doesn't mean you can't report data on it. You're welcome to report data on any element you want to. You just wouldn't be expected to if it wasn't relevant. This slide shows examples of cases where a particular performance data element would or would not be relevant to a program model. The number of children and youth served, that's the first line on this chart, is pretty clearly relevant to an education program that serves primarily K through 12 students. It would be pretty hard for them to make the case that this is not a significant part of their program design or theory of change. However, for a disaster relief program that assists beneficiaries of all ages, this performance data element is probably not relevant. If a disaster-focused grantee wants to track the number of children and youth they serve, that's fine. They are certainly welcome to report on this element in the GPR. However, they wouldn't be expected to. The number of hours served by recruited or managed volunteers, that's the second row in the chart, is probably relevant to a capacity building program for whom volunteer management is a central part of their program design. But a lot of grantees recruit volunteers for occasional events, like in this example, a college readiness program that recruits volunteers to help with a one-time graduation celebration. This would be considered peripheral to the program design. So a grantee in this situation wouldn't be expected to report on that performance data indicator unless they would like to. The third row here is the number of acres of public land supported. This is almost certainly going to be relevant to an environmental stewardship program that is working on land restoration or invasive species removal. But many other programs engage in one-time service projects or occasional service projects that may involve supporting public land in some way. The example on this slide is a Healthy Futures program whose members help clean up storm debris from a neighborhood park on MLK Day. That's a great activity, and the grantee is welcome to report the activity under the performance data element if they would like to, but they don't have to. So again, grantees should use their best judgment about whether or not a particular performance data element is relevant to their program model. If it is relevant, the data should be reported. If it's not relevant, the data can be reported if the grantee would like to do so. The final set of performance data elements that you see on this slide for AmeriCorps program grants is optional for all AmeriCorps State National program grantees. All of these elements are marked as new, they're in bold on this slide, but the reality is, again, that they're not actually new. These performance data elements are the same or very similar to the member-focused national performance measures that were available for AmeriCorps grantees to opt into prior to 2019. The only difference between these performance data elements and those old performance measures is that now no target setting is required to use these elements or to report the data, and there's no need to opt into a particular performance measure during the grant application process. The performance data elements will always be there for any grantee who would like to report this data about their AmeriCorps members. Again, it is optional, but we encourage you to do so, especially grantees for whom member development is an important part of your theory of change. Switching gears a little bit to narrative prompts for AmeriCorps program grants. The narrative prompts have not substantially changed from previous versions. But as I mentioned earlier, CNCF has increased the GPR's emphasis on activities that actually took place during the reporting period, not things grantees had planned to do or that they intend to do in the future. For example, while the data quality narrative prompt previously asked grantees to describe their process for verifying data from sites, the updated prompt asks for a recap of specific steps that were taken during the reporting period to verify the data reported in the GPR. Major change? No, but a change in emphasis. The performance management prompt, which you see on this slide, is also very similar to what it said in the past. Again, the only major change is to focus on specific actions taken during the reporting period rather than just describing a process in the abstract. So the updated prompt says, describe how you have used the data you have collected about your processes or outcomes, including performance measurement and evaluation data, during the reporting period to improve your program. Based on the data you have collected, what has worked well in your program during the reporting period, and what changes will you make in the coming year to improve processes and or outcomes to better address identified community needs. Now, this is the version for national direct and tribal grantees. The next slide shows the version for state commissions. Here's the version for commissions. Describe how you have supported sub-grantees during the reporting period to use data they have collected about their processes or outcomes, including performance measurement and evaluation data, to improve their programs. Provide examples of how sub-grantees have used data during the reporting period and or plan to use data in the coming year to make improvements to program processes and or outcomes to better address their identified community needs. On this slide, you see the changes to the training, technical assistance, and monitoring narrative prompt. The primary change here is for state commissions. Previously, commissions had to respond to this first bullet in the AmeriCorps State National GPR. Now, as you can see, both bullets will be covered in the Commission Support Grant GPR instead. So this one does not need to be responded to by commissions in the AmeriCorps GPR. But for National Direct and Tribal grantees, this prompt asks you to describe the training and technical assistance you provided to your sites during the reporting period, and describe how you monitored your sites during the reporting period. Discuss any significant issues or trends you have identified through programmatic and fiscal monitoring, and how you are responding to them. Let's switch gears now and talk about some commission-specific grants. Actually, you know what? Let me pause for a moment. We do have some questions in the queue. I want to thank folks who've submitted questions. So let me go ahead and answer some of those now. We'll do another Q&A at the end of the webinar. So the first question is, how do I ask for an extension should I need one? So that's an extension to the GPR deadline, due date. You would ask your program officer or portfolio manager, and they'll work with you on that. Second question, does this info about reporting periods for 2019 apply to 2018 cohorts? I'm currently working on the 2018 GPR, so I'm more concerned about that at the moment. I totally get that, yes. The 2018 GPR is due in a month and change, so I'm glad you're focused on that. Everything we're talking about in this webinar is for the 2019 grant year and beyond. It does not apply to the 2018 GPR that you're currently working on. So don't worry about that, just follow the instructions as they are posted online right now. Again, this is looking ahead to 2019, the GPRs that will be submitted in calendar year 2020.
I will note, sorry, this is
hey, Brittany's here.
that those resources are online on our Knowledge Network, so you can access the instructions and everything for the 2018 GPR online.
You can indeed. Thank you, Brittany. And Brittany's done a lot of work on our website, so she gets kudos for that. All right, next question. Does dollar amount mean both in-kind and cash donations? The answer to that is a very quick yes, it does. In-kind and cash can both be reported. Next question, I have 2 members that will go into 2020 from the 2018 grant, so they will still go on the 2018 report, not the 2019 report. Basically, the answer is yes. If you have data on those members, the outputs and outcomes from their service, in time to submit it on the 2018 GPR, then yes, please do that because they are 2018 members. If you don't have the data in time to submit it with your 2018 end of year GPR, you can hold that data over and report it in the 2019 GPR. The key here, they are 2018 members. Report them on the 2018 GPR if you can. If you can't, you can report it on the 2019 GPR. Thanks for that question. Next question, is the prompt in eGrants above each narrative question? Not in full, no. The narrative boxes have labels, but the instructions, the GPR instructions, is what gives you the detailed narrative prompt. So you do need to look at that website Brittany referenced, the GPR landing page. You can pull down the instructions from there by program year, and that's where you'll find the detailed narrative prompt instructions. All right, next question. You mentioned that we should report data that is collected between October 1st and September 30th. Is that different from reporting data from outputs and outcomes that actually occurred between October 1st and September 30th? It could be. I guess it depends on how much lag time you have between the when the event, the activity takes place and when the data is collected. I'm going to refer you to the specific language of the instructions on the performance data indicators that will be posted in December. That will clarify the difference between collected and activities that took place if there is a significant lag time between the two. So I appreciate the question. I know that's an important distinction. I don't have the language of the instructions in front of me right now for those definitions, so we'll get back to you on that. Next question, the leveraged funds. We don't know exact amounts each site spends, but we have an estimate. We don't want estimated funds here. What we want is something that is verifiable, meaning that you actually have a number that is measured. If you don't have systems in place to measure it, we understand this is new. Work with your program officer or portfolio manager on how to put those systems in place to track it. But yeah, we do want actuals, not estimates here. The estimates go into your application as projected figures. Next question, can the next webinar be presented without any CNCS jargon? I'm finding them hard to follow. I hear you. We have a lot of jargon. I doubt if it will be possible to do a webinar without any jargon. What I can do, though, is define it for you. So if you can respond again, put another question in the box, and let me know which pieces of jargon are confusing. I'll take some time to define those for you so that you can follow along. GPR is our biggest jargon that I'm saying repeatedly. That, again, stands for Grantee Progress Report. So I'll look for another question from you. Next question, if reporting on AmeriCorps members that gain employment is no longer an opt-in, does that expand the flexibility of granting compelling personal circumstances for members who exit early for gaining employment? The regulations on compelling personal circumstances have not changed. So please refer to the regulations about the requirements for giving an exit for compelling personal circumstances. That has not changed based on this reporting change. Next question, leveraged resources. Did you say not to include grantee share reported as match? Yes. The instructions for this will be very similar to the instructions in the AmeriCorps application for the other revenue field. In the other revenue field, you are instructed to only put in things that are not listed in your budget as formal match. It will be the same way for the progress report. You're only putting in resources that you didn't already report as match on the FFR. So thanks for that question. Next question was the same. Yes, leveraged funds over and above match. You're already reporting match on the FFR. No need to duplicate that. And question, might have missed this portion. When is the first report due for the 2019 grant? So again, it will depend on which kind of grant you have. But since we've mostly talked about AmeriCorps program grants at this point, those are the AmeriCorps grants that enroll and place AmeriCorps members. The 2019 end-of-year progress report will be due in December 2020. So it will literally be more than a full year before you actually report on the stuff I'm talking about now, but I want to make sure that you're prepared for it and that you're putting data collection systems in place now to be able to do that. All right, these are great questions. Thank you. Keep them coming. We'll go ahead and push forward a little bit in the presentation, but there's more Q&A time at the end. We are switching gears in the presentation right now to talk about commission-specific grants. So if you are a national direct or tribal grantee and you're on the webinar, this information for the next couple of slides is not going to be as directly relevant to you, but please hang in there for a few more minutes because we're going to talk about some GPR-related resources and answer more questions at the end of the webinar. So focusing in right now on commission support grants for the commissions on the line today. The performance data elements are on this screen are required for all state commissions in the Commission Support Grant GPR. The ones in bold were in your 2019 Commission Support Grant application instructions. These are the demographic indicators, as you may remember, that are taking the place of the previous performance measure requirement. Commissions will be given a lot of flexibility in how they measure improved capacity under these elements, but the reported value must be valid and verifiable. And as we usually do, we recommend using a pre and post assessment when at all possible. Here are the optional performance data elements, the optional ones for Commission Support Grant GPRs with new ones in bold. Not all commissions use Commission Support Grant funds to do volunteer engagement or disaster preparation and assistance, and we understand that. Similarly, not all commissions are in a position to leverage funding or in-kind resources for your commission support grants beyond what you're already reporting as formal match. We understand that as well. But if you do those things, that's why this is optional. We encourage you to report them here, but you don't have to. The changes to the Commission Support Grant GPR narrative prompts are very similar to the changes for the AmeriCorps Program Grant GPR narratives. For example, the performance management prompt, which you see on the slide here, has increased its focus on activities that occurred during the reporting period and asks commissions to talk about the successes and challenges of those activities. The collaboration prompt includes a similar revision, and it also invites commissions to describe any disaster-focused collaborations or partnerships they have initiated or sustained during the reporting period. The training, technical assistance, and monitoring prompt has been edited to focus on activities that take place during the reporting period, and also to mirror the prompt that national direct and tribal grantees are asked to respond to on the AmeriCorps Program Grant GPR. Finally, the Promising Practices narrative prompt is unchanged and is still optional. We'll move on now and talk about the Commission Support Grant's sister GPR, the Commission Investment Fund, or KIF GPR. I know that we're moving through this section relatively quickly, but this recorded training and the PowerPoint will be posted on the Grantee Progress Report webpage within the next couple of days, so you can look at it at a more leisurely pace as well. Here are the performance data elements for KIF, Commission Investment Fund GPRs. These elements were mentioned in the 2019 KIF application instructions and are designed to provide a sense of what you did with your KIF dollars and who your beneficiaries were. The narrative section will ask you to talk about the outcomes of those activities. So one required element is the number of KIF-supported professional development or training events or service projects. This could include events for AmeriCorps members and/or events for organizations. The second required indicator is the number of organizations participating in KIF-supported training or technical assistance activities. Organizations in this context can include current subgrantees, potential grant applicants, or any other organizations that participate in KIF-supported events. The training activities themselves could be focused on any of the KIF priority areas, including evaluation, data collection, the AmeriCorps grant application process, and so forth. Some of these organizations you're reporting may be the same organizations who received training and technical assistance supported by Commission Support Grant funds and who were reported on the Commission Support Grant GPR. And that is actually fine. If the same organizations get supported in different capacities by two different grants, you can count those organizations in the performance data elements for both grants. The third indicator here is number of Commission staff members receiving KIF-supported training or technical assistance. Nothing more to say about that. That was pretty self-explanatory. Optional for all commissions. One optional element, the dollar amount of resources leveraged by the commission. As commissions on the line know, KIF grants have no formal match, and there's no requirement that commissions leverage any additional funding beyond the CNCS grant amount to support these particular grant activities. But if you do, we encourage you to report it here. The changes made to the KIF GPR narratives follow the same pattern as the changes made on other GPR types, so I won't spend additional time talking about those changes here. But I do want to highlight one added narrative prompt, which is actually on the next slide. This narrative prompt is where you talk about the outcomes associated with the performance data element outputs you entered earlier. And this takes the place of the previous outcome performance measure requirement. The prompt is, describe how the activities supported by your KIF grant have resulted in significant and demonstrable improvements in one or more of the KIF priority performance areas included in your application. Numerical data is welcome if you have it, but if not, qualitative descriptions work fine also. Finally, let's talk briefly about Volunteer Generation Fund, or VGF, GPRs. Very few changes here. For example, there are no changes in the required performance data elements for this GPR type. You see them on the slide here. The changes to the VGF narratives are the same as the changes made elsewhere, so we'll skim over those for now. But please feel free to access this presentation on the AmeriCorps Grantee Progress Report page if you'd like to look at the changes in more detail before those updated instructions documents for 2019 get posted for all grant types in December. National Direct Tribal Grantees, thank you for hanging in there. I appreciate it. We are coming back to something that is applicable to everyone on the line today, which is, well, potentially, which is other GPRs for AmeriCorps, the AmeriCorps Program Grants, Final GPR, and the AmeriCorps Planning Grant GPR. I didn't mention those earlier because there's no significant changes to share for these two report types. Both include narrative questions only, and both cover the full grant period, which is typically 3 years for an AmeriCorps Program Grant and 1 year for an AmeriCorps Planning Grant. A quick reminder again that the Planning Grant GPR is only for National Direct or Tribal Planning Grants. Commission Planning subgrants are included in the Commission's regular Program Grant GPR. We are coming toward the end of the prepared content. We are going to answer some more questions. I see there's a couple in the queue, so hang tight on those for a moment. Let's talk briefly about some resources here that can help you understand the Grantee Progress Report requirements more thoroughly and prepare for submitting GPRs. We've mentioned a couple of times the AmeriCorps Grantee Progress Report webpage, link shown here. That's the first link on this slide. This is the repository for GPR instructions for all grant types, organized by grant year. You'll also find a tutorial on that site about how to use the Egrants GPR interface. And within a couple of days, you will find the recorded webinar and the PowerPoint from this training today. The second link on the slide, the grant terms and conditions, are your authoritative source for GPR due dates and reporting periods. The due dates you see in eGrants when you go into the progress report interface should always be correct, but the reporting periods listed in eGrants may not be. So if you're unsure what time period a particular report should cover, or if you want to double check a GPR due date, please read the terms and conditions for your grant type and grant year. As I mentioned way back at the beginning of the presentation today, CNCF uses progress report data to answer questions from our stakeholders, which include Congress and the American public, about the impact of CNCF programs across the country. So it's really important that AmeriCorps grantees set up their performance measures correctly during the application process, and then report on the GPRs complete, accurate, valid, and verifiable data on both performance measures and performance data elements. The first link on this slide takes you to the AmeriCorps performance measurement page, where you will find the performance measure instructions for each grant year, as well as training materials on performance measurement. The second link on this slide takes you to a recorded training on best practices in ensuring data quality, including practical examples and exercises that are related to GPR submission and also data verification. So that concludes the slides, and again, the part where I talk at you a lot. This is a great time to put any additional questions you have into the question and answer box. Again, that is different from the chat feature. Please put them in the question and answer box so that we can track them there and answer them more easily. First question that I see in there right now, can you please explain in detail the requirements for reporting on leveraged funds and the distinctions between that and match at the time of application and on the GPR? So that's a great question. At the time of application, the other revenue field in the application asks you to project the resources, both cash and in-kind resources, that you will use to support your AmeriCorps program beyond what is in your budget as formal match. Basically, we know that it costs more to support an AmeriCorps program than what we give you in federal funds, certainly, but it may also cost more than what you report in match to support an AmeriCorps program fully. And you're not required to report everything as match. And so if you do have additional funds that you use to support your AmeriCorps program, we ask you on the application to put that in the other revenue field. What we're asking on the GPR is that as you track that over the course of the year, that when you submit the GPR, you tell us the actual number. You predicted it in the application. The GPR is where you tell us the actual number. Other than that, the other revenue field and the GPR, the new GPR performance data element are the same. So again, it's funds that are not in your federal share or your match share, but are used to support your AmeriCorps program, or in the case of the commission grants, maybe your commission support grant or your KIF or so forth. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Feel free to ask another question if that's still not clear. Next question, is there a point of contact to whom we can address specific questions not covered clearly in the instructions? Yes, indeed there is. It is your program officer or your portfolio manager. They are your primary point of contact for all things. You also, depending on your situation, you may also have a grants officer that you work with right now. They could also be a point of contact, though primarily they would be a point of contact for FFRs at this point. For GPRs, for progress reporting, your program officer or your portfolio manager would be the place to take additional questions. How does this match? So here's the next question. How does this match or leverage affect EAP only grants? So EAP grants or fixed amount grants do not have a formal match. You do not have FFRs. You're not reporting on match to us, and you're not putting match in your budget. However, we still know that the amount of money we give you, especially if you're an EAP, is definitely not enough to support your full AmeriCorps program. So we do ask you in your application to tell us how much additional funding you project you will be using to support your AmeriCorps program beyond what you're receiving in federal funds. And the GPR works the same way. Please tell us in actuality the amount of money that you spent to support your program that is not reported as formal match, because fixed amount grants and EAPs don't have formal match. Hopefully that helps. Next question, what documentation has to exist with that leveraged funding reporting? Basically what we ask is that it be verifiable, that you are able to explain how you came to the number using actual values that you recorded over the course of the year. We are not prescriptive about how you do that. Your reporting systems are up to you, or sorry, your data collection and data management systems are up to you. Obviously, there are requirements for managing federal funds, which are very explicit. The funds that we're asking you about are not federal funds and they are not formal match. So how you track those is very much up to your organization and your program. Again, what we ask is that if we ask you, hey, where did you get that figure? That you don't just say, I made it up, not that you would, but that you don't say that you have a basis by which you came up with that figure. Next question is kind of what I just answered. Will leveraged funds reported be required to follow the same documentation rules as match? No. Formal match is a federal grant requirement. There are very strict requirements about how that needs to be tracked. Refer to your portfolio manager or your grants officer if you want more details about that. This is not match. And so it is up to your organization or your program how you want to track this. Next question, handling national tribal direct grant as of 9/1, have yet to enroll a member. What I've noticed in looking at previous enrollments, it looks like this is going to be a very specific question that probably is better taken up with a program officer or portfolio manager. So Douglas, thank you for the question. I'm going to refer you to your primary point of contact on this one because it looks like it's very specific to help support you in making sure that you're managing your grant effectively. But thank you for submitting the question. Let's see, I do not see any other open questions at the moment, so I will give you a little time to see if there are additional questions that you want to ask. I am going to toss the baton to Brittany a little bit since she is our training guru. She can talk to you about training in general and how the webinar today fits into a broader picture of training that we provide. So, Brittany.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll just quickly state, I put the link for our Knowledge Network in the chat box. That's nationalservice.gov/resources/AmeriCorps. That's kind of your home base for accessing a lot of our training resources for state and national. In the AmeriCorps Staff Development Training Series, I think is the title of it, that's where you'll find all of these recorded webinars. So in the next couple of days, this exact webinar will be posted to YouTube, and I will link that in that page. So you can find a lot more of those resources there, in addition to some of the things that Sarah has already referenced that are very useful. So if you aren't finding what you need, you can send a response to me. There's also a link there, and let me know what additional training you need. Also, you can do that through your portfolio manager or program officer. All right, Sarah, I think we had one more question.
All right, one more question. Our reporting year already started. How are we supposed to track leveraged funds when we are 3 months into our 2019 program? Good question. First of all, remember that this is a performance data element, so it is time period based. So it's based on the time period of October 1st through September 30th of the following year. So that should help a little bit. That being said, yeah, we're in late November and this began in October. So given the circumstances, if you don't have full data, reporting the data you have is better than no data at all. Report what you can report. We know this is the first year where we're still figuring out systems. You're still figuring out systems to report on these things. So just do the best you can reporting on it and get some good systems in place to report on this moving forward.
Great.
Okay. Thank you so much for all the questions. Thanks for all of the engagement in the webinar today. Again, your program officer or portfolio manager is your resource to answer additional questions about progress reporting. But we thank you for attending. Thank you in advance for the progress reports that you will submit in the near future and also next year. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.